Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm sorry about the weather, but maybe it's a good deal because if we got any more people attended here tonight, we'd be out of space. All of you have the agendas, and please look at them before you come to the next lecture. They're not all held in the same spot, as you'll notice. I think the next lecture is here, then I'm not going to say, but I think the next one's the library after that. Courthouse, I'm sorry. It's Beulah in the courthouse, and she's here tonight. But please look, because they're not going to be all in the same place. The lecture tonight says in the paper, I'd like to give this lecture. Well, that's not true. I'm not going to. The only thing I'm going to do is be a gopher, show a few things, pick up a few things, kind of do what I'm instructed. See, that's a little different than what I'm usually used to. My suit and tie will not be at every one of these sessions. This is the way I came from work tonight because I was supposed to be here at 5:30. And so this is the way I came. I think Frank and Jim came the same way. So you're comfortable, and that's the way we're going to be from this point out. The lecture tonight got me involved in archaeology and collections and the study of Native Americans back in the spring of 1967. I found an artifact on a farm where I was helping a farmer, as a poor college student, trying to get through school. And the man who owned the farm says, well, I don't know what it is, but it's an Indian artifact. But I know this guy you can go see. He knows everything there is to know about it. So he took me up to Bob's. And Bob Nesius spent about an hour getting me enthused in prehistoric people, their culture, their tools, the way they led their life. That started what's almost been a 30-year hobby for myself. It's turned into a 30-year friendship for Bob and I. We've enjoyed this hobby together. We've enjoyed giving lectures together. And the lecture that Bob's put together tonight, I think you'll all enjoy. Any of you during this whole lecture series that has a question or a comment during the lecture, please just interrupt us. I don't care who the lecturer is, we all like to get those questions out so we can answer your questions as you sit through. Those of you who are taking it for credit, at the end of the session, I'd like to meet with you so we can understand how we're going to get this thing graded and what I've got to grade in the end of this. Somebody said, do we have to do 10 pages? Or Frank says 10 pages on each lecture. I can tell you right now, I'm not reading 10 pages. I ain't got that much time. But anyway, if you'll meet with me after the session for about 10 minutes, we'll have that outlined for you and tell you how excuses and everything will be handled. Other than that, let's get started with the lecture. I'd like to introduce to you Bob Nesius, local collector and amateur archaeologist.
Thank you, Phil. Phil called about 2 months ago, which is not unusual, and he says, how would you like to give a lecture, a 2-hour lecture on artifacts? And it's kind of like asking Grandma if she got pictures of her grandkids. So I've got a captive audience, and I'm going to take advantage of it. I'd like to start, Phil started, how many years ago, Phil?
1967.
67. I started when I was 6 years old. My dad moved from Franceville. My dad and mother, Paul and Beulah Nesius, moved from Franceville over into this area just east of Rensselaer. And my uncle, Earl Nesius, and Audrey lived just down the way. And Earl was always interested in artifacts, more so than my dad was. So he came down, went down there, get an old junky Dodge pickup. He come rattling in, and he says, "Bob, let's go Arrowhead hunting." I said, "Sounds all right to me." I said, "Where are we going?" He says, "South America." Well, that was real enchanting. Well, anything south and east Catholic Cemetery to me was South America. So we go to South America quite often. We hunt arrowheads. And I remember going out and finding quite a few, really. He didn't find too many, but I was finding quite a few. I'd fill my pockets up. At that time, it was a little easier. But about the fourth time out, I noticed he was flicking them in front of me. Dummy like I am, I says, "Earl, you're throwing them in front of me. Why are you doing that?" Well, from then on, that quit, and then I had to start finding them on my own. But I had it made and didn't know it. And then I remember Audrey and Earl, we would go to possibly Indianapolis one time to Earl Townsend, a noted lawyer down there, still alive yet, a very old man. One of the largest collectors in, I'd say, United States or even the world as far as American artifacts. We went to his home. I remember walking in, there's a Rembrandt just over the door. It's quite impressive. But he had a very nice collection. I got to meet a lot of the old-time collectors. A lot of them are gone. But I did pick up some artifacts. I remember Earl bought some stuff for me. We brought them home, and eventually I ended up going to the meeting myself, displaying mostly an educational phase of it. And I still attend these meetings when I can. But there's more interest now than there was many, many years ago. There's more people hunting arrowheads today than what there was 30, 40 years ago. I don't know why the tillage we have is terrible for arrowhead hunting. We like for it to rain, the wind blow, and erosion, and all that stuff. That makes it real good. Wally just don't get excited, but erosion and arrowhead hunting go together real well. I do belong to the Northwest Indiana Archaeological Association, the Indiana Archaeological Association from this particular group. I had to subscribe to many magazines, and I have quite a volume of books on artifacts and archaeology. When I first found an arrowhead, I can remember picking it up, and I rubbed on it. I was looking for a date. Of course, you know that's impossible. I want to know how old that thing was. So I knew that wasn't going to work. So I did get some volumes of books. I would take these relics to collectors and stuff like that. At that time, there wasn't a lot of volume. There were just a few. So by putting things together and asking and coming up, I could come up with some answers. Not all of them. I want to know where the chert come from. Where did they haul this chert in? What's it worth? How much is this arrowhead worth? And how did it make it? And there's so many questions I had. So over the period of years, I've tried to answer a lot of these questions. I think I've got some of them answered anyway. The worth of them sometimes varies quite a little bit. Depends on style and type and workmanship, of course. This first hour session, I'd like not to get into Jasper County yet. I'd like to travel, about 6,000 miles. It's going to take us 40,000 years to do it. I don't know if you all are ready for this or not. But about 100,000 years ago, the Wisconsin Glacial started in the northern part of the continent. And as it grew, it took, say, you'd almost go 60,000 years, and it captured all this water up in all these oceans. It lowered the oceans actually 200-300 feet. So this created a land bridge from Siberia. I was going to use an imaginary map. I don't know if that'd work or not. But let's say this is our West Pacific coast, Siberia, Alaska up here, and Jasper County, Rensselaer right behind me. Whoop. Okay. So across Siberia and Alaska, when that water lowered, it created a land bridge. And by doing so, these people could come across. It's about, I think, 36 miles. It's there today because the water is back out of the glaciers. Now it's flooded. But as they came across, they didn't come across, remember this, they didn't come across as explorers. They were in pursuit of the woolly mammoth and the prehistoric bison. They were trying to survive. So they weren't explorers. They were predators after these huge animals. And as these animals would graze, they would always keep them in their contact. So what it amounted to, I read one story, one article one time, that said maybe they would only move 75 miles in one generation. Their generation a lot shorter than we are today. They're probably in the 30s was their generation. They had a very hard life. In fact, going over this the other night, in fact, it was last night, I tried to imagine the severity these people went through, the hardship that they went through. I closed my eyes, and the next day I was asleep, and I had this dream, like Martin Luther King. I had this dream. Here's Phil and I walking down this, well, let's begin as from Alaska down into our midsection. There's an ice-free corridor that didn't freeze. There's a glacier on each side. The western glacier skirted along the east side of the Rocky Mountains. And so this left a corridor all the way down into the midsection that these animals grazed and moved very slowly. So I seen Phil and I walking down this corridor. He was on my right. In behind Phil was his wife Ellen, two girls, Shannon. In behind me was my wife and three children. And I can remember Phil's girls was complaining about one had the other's animal robot or something. My three kids were cold and wet. Dre and Ellen got together and decided they was hungry. They wanted a steak. I said, what kind of a steak? A woolly mammoth steak. As it's displayed here. I looked to my left, and here's this huge mammoth, 14 feet tall at the shoulders. And I know the tusk was at least 16 foot long. And I said, Phil, I says, bring your spear and come over here and slay this animal. He stepped up to him, and he had this plaid animal robot. He says, I don't think so, Bob. Now Phil being smarter than I am, he says, why don't we wait until a piece of this ice falls off, hits one in the head, or we'll find one in an avalanche, or possibly a calf will get lost. Well, this is basically what they did. I can't see them doing this unless it's for sport, and I think at that time they was too concerned about being, providing for themselves. So this may be a little out of context, but this is the size that some of those animals actually slayed. They had the ivory for tools. They had the bone they made tools out of. They had the skins and stuff for robes. It wasn't only the woolly mammoth. They had the mastodon, and they also had the bison was probably the most popular animal that they would encounter. A huge, huge buffalo, probably 3 times the one we have today. We could probably get on with, as we came down the west coast, or in that ice-free corridor, we can assume that some of them, probably when the glacier was the furthest to the south, these people were pretty well headed down into Mexico, Central America, and South America. As that glacial retreated, now say it was 40,000 years they came across, most people agree at that. As they came across and moved slowly down, the glacier was moving back all the time. And I'd say probably, about 15,000 years, the glacier maybe was in our area, retreated back, depositing all these stones and rocks that we have today we farm over. Float copper, such things as that was brought here from the northern country. And some of them came across into New Mexico, and some of them Wyoming in that area. And then you see maybe an area where they skirted along the edge of the melting glacier, which would be kind of a terrain thing that they might trademark. They might want to keep in constant visual vision of it, so they wouldn't get lost. So they followed this edge. And as they come down, there's a lot of water melting, creating the rivers, the Ohio River, the Kankakee River, and things like that. And I can't believe they didn't maybe come down some of these rivers, wait and come back. But this is what led them into Jasper County, is by coming along this area. Now in Folsom, New Mexico, 1926, I may need to refer to my notes here. They found a fellow cowboy looking for calves, found some bones in a ravine. And after digging and investigating, he knew he was on to something rather important. So he got a hold of the university in that area, and they came down. They decided they were the great longhorn bison. And along with these was the fluted knife, or the fluted point, that these paleo, first time used that paleo people used. And so we had in association. At that time in 1926, there's a lot of controversy as how old is archaeology in the United States. A lot of people like to think it wasn't all that old. So when this site was found, they took all these bones out, and And these artifacts showing even scratches on the bones. Everybody was up in arms about it. They wanted to make darn sure that that was what it was. And so they carbon-14 the bones, which has carbon in it. Any living thing has carbon in it. So by measuring what carbon is left in it, you can come up with a pretty precise age now. And it took them back to about 35,000 years ago. Wait, let me check in that area. 15,000. They were 15,000 years old. So what you're looking at, 40,000 years ago, brought them, so 25,000 years later, here they are in New Mexico. Now, a lot of the universities disputed this. They said that's too old. So it took 3 years for these universities to settle on that this was a very rich find, a very good archaeological find, and they all accepted the fact that it was 50,000 years old. So that kind of turned archaeology in a new path in the United States. And so since then, people can grasp possibly these 1,000-year-old dates a lot easier than what they did. I can remember when I first grew up, something 1,000 years old was terribly, terribly old. But in this case, it was documented and it has really helped. Now, I'd like to get into some questions. Do you have any questions so far on this? Phil, pass around the fluted point and that knife.
We'll start in there. That knife and these are the fluted points. Just kind of pass the around so everybody can check.
Let me hold one up first. This was considered a knife. Now these people were butchers. They were slaying these very large animals, and they were butchers. They needed a knife. So this is nothing but a flint or chert knife, and they wrapped it with some sort of a handle. This is not a thing. This is reproduction. This is just a show. But this is considered a knife. And these particular points here, when it goes around, these again are reproductions. But they have a flute in them, very classic of Paleo man. And it's terribly hard to do. They had quite the ability to flute this. What they were trying to do, we seem to think, is not a bloodletting tool or anything like that. It streamlined the shaft, so it would penetrate these heavy hides. They didn't have the big barbs on or anything like this. They wanted to get into the vital areas. So by streamlining the shaft, it would allow it to get into that area. There's been several pieces found in Jasper County. I have one up here, and you come up there, there's a little brown point. Second row, the first one. It was found here in Jasper County. Yep, Phil.
Bob, were any similar points found over in Siberia?
Yes. There's quite a linkage between the Siberians, Mongoloids, and stuff like that in that area. You can follow that trace right on across.
Any other parts of Asia?
Any what, Phil?
Any other parts of Asia where those points have been found, if you know of?
I don't know. Phil, you want to get on that?
Actually, even in the Philippine Islands, the Stone Age people they found about 20 years ago, remember it was in National Geographic, nobody ever touched them. Their tools that they used are almost identical to tools we found in the United States. It almost seems to be a uniform way of progression. And their tools are the same. Those types of tools are found all over the world. So it obviously was a method used by prehistoric people that became the first way of survival, using what's around to survive.
The knife you said was chert. What type of rock is that?
Well, we mistakenly call it, George Johnson and I talked about it a little bit ago, we mistakenly call it flint, as I feel. Flint is more or less reserved for like Norway. There's some material over there that just absolutely, it's like oak opposed to our pine. It's a very durable flint. They'll call it flint because of the quality, I guess I should say. Supposedly we have real nice chert, or real high quality chert, but they say not to call it flint, but we all do, so I'm going to try and get by with it. But some flints work a whole lot better than others. And Paleo people had to find this out. They had to find this source because the fluting technique You have to do that with flint, what we call it's predictable. When you strike that flint, you have to know what that material is going to do. You're not going to do it with an old quarry piece of chert or something like that. It has to be type flint that you can control and predict. They had a way of seeking these sites out. Usually when the glacier, as it cuts these rivers, they'd find what they call outcroppings. That flint nodule, Phil, they would find these come on southern Indiana and the Ohio River. These would wash out. As the river runs through, these rocks would tumble in. And I'm sure several of them maybe got broken, opened up, and it showed on the inside, there's our chert.
Is there quite a bit in this area, or was it?
No, the chert we have in this area is usually a glacial deposit of stuff that's real knotty, like a knotty 2x4. And it really doesn't work quite well. The material we have closest to us that they use considerably, and you'll see a lot of in this frame in intermission, is the Indiana green. It's a white streaked green flint. That flint was found in the Lafayette area over towards Attica, and it was under a form. It's considered a layeral flint because it's under a layer of limestone, as I understand. They were digging it up, put on roads, and they got into this green vein. And prehistoric man found it, knew it was workable, and they utilized it. That was part of their survival. You know, they did what they could to survive. They had no VCRs, no 3-wheelers, 4-wheelers, anything like that. But had a tremendous drive to survive. I think we all should admire them for that. Turn us loose and do something like that, I think we'd all perish within a week. Phil, when you get into how they struck this off and the preforms and using this flake with.
Over here is a maul, okay? These nodules.
You don't work over my case, Phil.
I didn't break it. You're talking about the animals that are killing us like that. These nodules came up, and these come out of creek beds and things. You'll find a lot of them down in southern Illinois, southern Indiana. They would take a hammerstone just like this, and then would find a crevice or crack where they could get a good striking, and when they hit, they'd knock it open. And as it came open, it revealed all that they had inside to work with. And you see this one, you see the flaws here, and the prehistoric man's going to know right away that this is not going to work real well. This piece here, if you notice, is almost smooth. So he's got a good piece of work to work with here. He takes, after he opens it, he's going to take a huge antler, and believe me, this works better than wood. It works better than rock. For some reason, antler, especially elk antler, will traverse across the stone and break it off. They'll find a ledge where they can work off a piece that they want to work with. And they'll look at their stone. It's called reading the stone. They'll strike it with this large piece, and it will flake off chunks of flint. This is a core piece here that's been come off, and I'll explain that in a minute. But what they're trying to do is end up with a piece like this, which is a blade. Now, you think, well, what are they going to do with that? It's an ugly piece of flint. If you take this, oh, I'm sorry. Here, that's I think it's probably a crib mound blade here.
That is crib mound blade.
If you take that,
18,000 of them found in one cache. 18,000 blades.
And take it over to one of these points, like for instance here, and you lay that thing down, you can see what he's done is he's made himself a working base. Now he's going to take his flint tool. Let me see, where's the antler tool?
The flaker?
Oh, I'm sorry. They're going to take he's going to take his antler, he's going to chip off these big long flakes in here, okay? You can see them as he's laterally.
That's considered thinning lakes, or thinning
strikes. He's going to use this to do that with, okay? He's going to do it from a bridge. When he gets done with that, and you'll watch flint nappers, they'll lay this down on their pants leg with a piece of leather, and they'll take this bantler and they'll start chipping the edge out. And in about a good flint napper in 20 minutes can make a point like this. Okay? This morning I was over at a friend's of mine in White County. He made one out of an ice tray.
Oh,
that's an ice tray bottom, folks, and that's an arrowhead. It obviously is not authentic prehistoric. This is circa 1994. That's how it's done. It wasn't done in any other way. That is a piece of antler mounted in a handle.
I mean the other. What'd you name it?
This is just a blank, what we refer to them as.
We call them preforms.
Preforms.
Okay.
Now the other thing that's here, if you look at them, are these bladelets. They knock off a core like this, and you see these little ridges here? What they would do is they'd work a little ridge in here, and then they would strike down, and what it does, it flakes off a piece like this. If you'll pick this up, they use these to cut with, you'll find that the edges are absolutely perfectly sharp, and they were used as cutting tools. They're easy to make. If you could sit with a core of these, not even know anything about it, in 20 minutes you'd come up with 5 or 6 of them, so they're easy to make.
Obsidian flakes quite well. You will find a few pieces in Jasper County of obsidian, but they had to come from quite a ways west. Their trade routes were very extensive, and some of it did find their way here. Again, we call this percussion, where they knock large blades off, and then this particular type is called pressure flaking. So you have percussion and pressure flaking, primary and secondary flaking. The antler, Phil said, works a lot better than steel. Should you take, say, a concrete nail was terribly hard, and force it down on this edge, say use pressure flaking, it's just going to break out an area where it makes contact with the nail. But now you take the antler itself, the antler is a little broader, but has a gripping power. It kind of grips, and when it takes off a flake, it takes off a large flake. And this is what they want to do. They want to take a large flake off. So that's why antler was very good for them. It was handy. They had it. For people to make these points today, the ones passed around are reproductions. They're made with something similar to a drill press, where you can actually put this point down right exactly where you want it. Use precision to do it. But as far as an individual, I think probably Don Cochran, Ball State, is one of the better flint knappers, using the same tools that was available to the Indian at that time. He's very good. I don't think he has quite, I don't think he can knock out some of them blades yet, but he's good. And it takes him a little while to do it. He stand there, he strikes, and then he might say, darn it, and throw it away. They call that a cross fracture. He throws it away and starts over again. I was going to see these pieces here. We can imagine you don't find many nodules up here. These both were brought up from Harrison County, Indiana, Spencer County area. I'm sure they knocked these off down there, and they brought these up as workable preforms. Rather than haul one of these up here, maybe 40% of its waste, they knew enough to bring these up. Their trade routes are very extensive. They brought flint from Ohio, some beautiful flint out of Ohio. Yes.
Bob, you were saying the edge of the glacier 15,000 years ago was along New Mexico?
No, it was up in our area.
It was up in our area?
Yeah, it was about done with. That's about time the from 10,000.
Its furthest point south, what was the thickness of the glacier, say in Jasper County? Do you have any idea?
Once more.
The thickness of the glacier in Jasper County when the glacier was at its furthest point south?
You mean height-wise? I've heard 2 mile. I can believe I've heard 3 mile. Would be a little skeptical. 2 mile up is a long way. 50 feet up is a long way. But it was a tremendous piece of ice. And it captured all this water up in all these oceans and stuff. And I forget what some of the predictions they made, how far out, you get off the continental shelf. Even out further than that, there was land showing then. And the stuff, of course, as this glacier melts, it drops all the debris it has picked up on the way down. This big rock like there at Jackson Funeral Home there in that little park, Rensselaer Park, that was a glacial deposit. And it's a little hard to comprehend, really. George?
When Bill Jackson was building their house out here on the ridge north of town, and digging the well, they were down way over 100 feet with the well, and they flushed out, when they were flushing it out, they flushed out a good solid piece of wood. Now, the only way you could figure out the wood got down 100 feet or more was when the glacier got up there, and that's a ridge that's about half rock. But anyway, they took it and carbonated that wood, and it carbonated 15,430 430.
That's believable, but I'm sure there's a lot of you here don't like to think back that far.
But that is right here in this 2 miles out of town.
This tooth is it. Yeah, here it is. This was found up in one of the muck bogs up there in the William Garyon area, just right close to where we're at there. This tooth, they seemed to like to put the mastodon and mammoth out here probably about 10,000 years ago. And by that time, these people finally got into Jasper County. So they were here. We have no association of paleo points with the mastodon here, which is quite, I mean, you're talking years and years. It's hard to say direct association like they had in Folsom, New Mexico. That was, you know, a rather unusual find to be able to document it like they did.
When were those found, those teeth?
Oh, Sunshine the Board found those, oh golly, 25 years ago probably. Phil has one. I'm not sure where did it come from, Phil.
Over near Berkeley Township.
Okay, and then at the college now, there's some in the geology department. Bill, what was his name?
No.
Mike?
Mike Davis.
Mike Davis, there you go. Mike has one complete lower and upper jaw. They're in the geology department. I think it's still there today. And then I think another lower jaw with teeth intact. And they were found out here big as a junkyard. Again, a swamp, low area where they probably got marred down in. This is not unusual, and they preserve quite well in that type of situation because the oxygen can't get at them. Most of your bones, of course, on top of the ground go roll around, and through moisture and air and things like that, they would deteriorate. But that stuff down low in the muck, which stuff has a tendency to get buried in, preserves quite well.
How long ago was the teeth found?
I'd say probably 25 years ago anyway. And it was up there, well, I say the old packing sheds. That tell you anything? By the old packing sheds. Okay, north of Gifford 1 mile and probably a mile back west again. That's what we call the old packing shed road. And there's been several teeth found on Highway 14. Gerald Stanton had found some there. They were smaller ones. And then I think on George Gratner's place, one was found there right on 14. So this area there in the Gifford-Newland area was a tremendous marsh at one time, you know, hundreds of acres under marsh, and ideal for wildlife. And in pursuit of wildlife was prehistoric man. And he would camp on the high grounds around this, and by that time, as the people got into this area, they weren't quite as nomadic. They moved around a lot. They didn't have permanent residence or any settlement, so to speak of. But they did utilize those particular areas because it was handy for them. So any high ground around a natural stream or around a swamp has always been real good hunting. Any other questions? I like questions. Gary, you got a question?
No, you're doing fine.
What am I doing up here? I don't know. How are we doing on time?
Got about another 15 or so minutes.
Okay. I didn't really want to get into Jasper County until the last section. This I consider an archaic. Now this was rooted out by hogs. I have done some excavating work, but been with archaeologists, and I try to stay straight out, especially now because there's so many rules and regulations now it's almost impossible. They don't even want you to pick up an arrowhead. They've even thought if you pick up one, you got to go get the sheriff, and the sheriff gives it to the Western Indians. Well, it's not that bad yet, but it could be someday. So most of the excavating I have done is not so much been on my own. When we've dug down into say old campsite, stuff like that, or in one particular case, a burial in over around, where was that, Phil, for that lady, LaPorte, over in that area. Notre Dame team came out. We worked with Notre Dame for probably about 6-7 weeks, and a group of students came out, and they stayed there at Wheatfield. And they took a lot of ground survey, they did some excavating, they just happened to run onto this burial. It was on the Kankakee River again, right next to the river. They exposed some bones, and it was the last day of their particular outing. So they covered them back up again, And you tell a collector they dug bones, they're thinking, treasure. And they had people out there digging potholes, something crazy. So they called our group up, the Northwest Indiana Archaeological Group. It says, come terminate this burial. Because people climbed the fences, and what it really was a scaffold burial, showing that it was the later Indian, and they didn't have lavish burying offerings like the earlier Indian did. So we went out and we did dig up. We found what we call bundle burials. They had been on a scaffold, supposedly, because as we dig down, you'd have the skull and a lot of the big bones there, and all the little bones were gone, because they had probably the birds that carried off stuff like this, or from the scaffold to the burial site, they had got lost. So we can assume that it was a scaffold burial. Very little offering, maybe a clay pot. And that one, I don't even know if we come up with any clay, did we? They were just different age groups in there that I remember. Could have been a disease or something. But it was the later Indian. Some other excavations we dug just usually at random. Our group, now it's getting terribly hard to get licensed to dig back, let's say 8 years ago on your property. You can do whatever you want to on your property. Now you can't. If there's bones found on your property, teeth, even teeth, and that's not uncommon to find old teeth on your sand hills, because there's a lot of people lived there, thousands of people lived there. They estimate along the Kankakee River, maybe a 10-mile stretch, it might be 20,000 burials in that area, just at random. These people, the later culture didn't bury mounds. They didn't make a mound area that would be recognized later as being a burial ground. So teeth are not uncommon. You're supposed to get hold of the game warden. The game warden gets hold of the state archaeologist. State archaeologist sends out a crew of people. They put up a bunch of plastic tape. We're talking teeth. And then they send out several people, and they tell them they don't have any funding, that, well, maybe we'll have to wait a while until we get some funding. They have all kind of rules and regulations, but nothing to fund them. This is their problem, see. And then they went to landlord, well, maybe if you'd help out a little bit, we'd get this done, And then maybe you could rebury these bones. The Indian Movement Group wants us to rebury these bones. Would you buy the burial plot? Or would you want to buy the structure to put them in? We had this up in Couch. It was a joke. And we had state archaeologists at our next meeting, and we went over it pretty good. The part that kind of tickled me, the Porter County coroner was there, all dressed up. And Gary Ellis at that time was telling us what had to be done. He'd gone through all these regulations, And this fellow holds up his hand and says, Mr. Ellis, I'm the Lake County coroner. He says, shouldn't I know something about that? It's in my county. He said, I never thought about that. But it was, a human remains found in Porter County. So even now, even though if you determine, or if I determine it's prehistoric, it still has to be reported. And they go through all this bunch of junk. Of course, you can't farm it or anything like that. So I haven't really reported it. Have you, Phil? I don't. Something of significance, I sincerely think should be, because it should be done by professionals. I've dug with them. It's just probably the most boring thing you can do. Terribly, terribly slow. It's usually hot. But they dig with, not with shovels, they dig with brushes. And then they'll take a brush a little bit, and then they'll take water and they'll flush the side down, and then they'll go some water. I usually have to leave. I've done a little surveying for them, and I usually leave. Then I come back an hour or two later, or maybe half a day later, then I can see what's done. They dug up there for 4 days, Kankakee River. Last August, it was hot. And we did finally get state permission, we did finally get state permission. We're the only private organization who has got permission to dig here in our area on a particular site for so many days, they go by meter squares. We could put down 3 meter squares. Depth wasn't a problem. But it has to be all surveyed. It took a lot of surveying to get this done. I mean, it's a lot of work. And now they're just to the point now we're cleaning the artifacts up and get them labeled, and they'll end up downstate. We found one arrowhead, a broken base, some pottery sherds. But it took that gal. It was terrible. We dug another site up on the Kankakee River again, up there on Dean Sigger's place. We went down and we went out. There's a group of us. Our group went out. This is before we had to have permission. And I think George was there. we were digging, well, Phil too, we were digging like I thought we should, you know. We were throwing sand and we'd hit something, we'd stop and we'd look. Then down we go again. And we found a whole lot more that way because we covered a whole lot more area. But the state, they want pollen. They want to pick up pollen and stuff, which they can really get back on pollen until the age. I mean, it's, but, and then maybe you people read, when was that? That was duck hunting season last year. Monticello, where they lowered the lake over there, they came upon some burials. Dennis Krentz, I believe it was, he and his son, Todd. Anyway, they had found these burials, and they went through the procedure. They got a hold of the game warden, the state archaeologist, and finally Purdue University went out there. We went over there, as I remember, Phil and I, we lost our patience, I remember. We ended up going duck hunting and had a lot of fun. But they are terribly meticulous, but they did find some burials. It was considered to be a late Mississippian culture. They took some pollen tests. I don't, was there anything of any significance, Phil, as I remember?
I remember that they called us because they said it was a salvage site, which means it has to be excavated quickly and get out of there because they're going to flood the lake.
They wanted to put the generator back in.
And so they call us to go over there, and then you have 10 experienced people standing around watching a student with a toothpick. And so we walked the site, and we picked up more artifacts than the experts had picked up walking the site for a week. We walked it for about an hour, and we found more than they found in a week. We turned it in, and we went duck hunting. Bob's right, we got bored.
But the archaic people get back to the glacier a little bit as this water was still captured up. A lot of water still captured up in the glacier. In this area, the Kankakee River, the Iroquois or something like this, there's an area, now say Kankakee River in the south a little bit, there's an area, it was underwater up until maybe, I can remember maybe 30 years ago they finally drained it. But previous to that, to the glacial period, that water was clear back in its channel. All there was a channel there. And there's some high ground there that's not exposed, as I remember 10 years ago, it was covered up with water. But this high ground right along this main channel, you'll find a paleo and maybe early archaic points on there because that land was available to them at that time because the water hadn't come back out. And we call that a single component site. Now some of the larger hills, back further yet on top of the hills, you get into what they call a multiple component site, which you'll find woodland points along with the others. How we doing, Phil? I want to get in this cultural periods.
You want to take a break before you start at the end of it, or do you want to do it right now?
All right, let's take a break. Now I want to get into the periods. I'm jumping around a little bit because we did have the Paleo, the Archaic, the Woodland, and the Mississippian periods. This puts things in perspective a little better.
Okay, rather than get into the second part, which will be longer, we have some refreshments back here for everyone, and feel free to help yourself. Those of you who are not taking it for credit, we ask that you might leave a little donation to help cover the refreshment cost. Those of you who are taking it for credit, you paid for it. So we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Get yourself something to drink, a cookie, something, stretch, whatever. I make the same announcement they make it for this building is not... One, maybe teachers, or two, may be interested in learning how ancient people lived, either Native Americans or prehistoric Americans. Dr. Kenny and I visited a place in Michael, Illinois recently, and they have a school there called the Ancient Lifelines Institute. Ellie and John White. John is a Native American, and he Shawnee, Cherokee, and as he said, with a little scotch. I couldn't figure out that's what he drank or that was his heritage. But anyway, they're very talented people, and they put on schools for people who, one, want to learn how the prehistoric people and primitive people and Native Americans live. They put on schools for school teachers to teach you how to plan a curriculum on Native Americans and prehistoric Americans. And I brought there's some of the regular brochures up here. Anyone can go there. They put on schools the whole summer long. I put together a small packet for anyone who's really interested. On the back, I always like it, is they send this out to everyone. Cherokee is a written language, by the way. There's 79 letters in its alphabet. The last page of the brochures is grace in native tongue and in different forms, and they always include that in their literature. I have about 20 of these, and I have about 30 of their brochures. Any of you who are interested, please take anything. I think you'll enjoy it. It's not a real expensive thing. Your housing, you can stay in a motel if you want. Otherwise, you can live in a log house, sleep on wood benches, eat corn soup. It's really kind of neat. I think you'll enjoy it. It's down where the Mississippi and the Illinois River comes together. Any of you who are interested in archaeology, John was the director of the Campfield site for Northwestern University. Bob and I are familiar with it. We didn't realize how close we were to John Elmer when he visited the site. But to those of us in amateur archaeology, the Campfield site was probably the most rewarding site that's been excavated in the Midwest. These people lived just 3 miles from that site, and he was the director. As Jim will tell you, when you go to their house, you actually drive through the creek. They don't have a bridge, and they have an old log cabin that's been converted to their home, and they're just wonderful people to be around, and they're very skilled in the native arts and the native languages. Any of you who happen to have Native American blood, at least name. John encourages everyone he knows with Native American blood to please join them in the summer when the name giver's there so that you may obtain your Native American name and in some fashion preserve your Native American heritage. Most of us are not Native Americans, no matter what we do. But anyone that is interested in any of these materials, they're up here, and afterwards come and get them, and I would encourage any of you to go down. John and Ellie will show you a real nice time for a week. They showed Jim and I a real nice time for a day, and I think we'll probably go back. They can also show you some of the biggest snapping turtles you ever seen. They have a snapping turtle you can put your head in its mouth. Anyway, it's a last game, so we weren't worried. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Bob, and for the second half of the lecture.
Campfield site, I like. They use machinery down there, conveyors of all things. Not toothbrushes, but conveyors. I was real impressed with that. Before we go on, we went through the Paleo period. I maybe not pointing these out quite well. But we do have 4 periods of man, excluding contact period, as the Europeans came over. We went pretty well through the Paleo period, 40,000, 10,000 years ago. We are now in Jasper County. You know how happy they must have been. They've got into Jasper County. So we're going to go through these 3 phases, periods or phases, what you call them, the Archaic, the Woodland, and the Mississippian. And here I have the chief artifacts. You won't be able to read it from there, and also some of the social and religious activities, but you can see how they have grown. It's placed into the Woodland period, which was our very classic period in this area. The Archaic period people, we have a lot of artifacts from representing the Archaic period in this area. A majority of these larger ones are Archaic. They again were still butchers, but if you notice, they have notching now. Notching was unheard of in the earlier Paleo periods. This particular group, you might want to hold up, Phil. Some of those in the bottom left corner, the broken bases, they were found in Jasper County. They didn't have the notchiness. So notching was sort of an evolution characteristic. Again, I like these particular points. There's only one found that I know of, a complete one in Jasper County, that shows what we call the striking anvil. Now this little brown piece was found by, I believe, Albert Pullens' dad, Winford Wintford, I believe. Jean Pullins is here this evening, Jean Pullins Campbell. Her father, Max Pullins, he had helped get me excited through my years. I used to go down and visit with Max, and he was terribly interested. He had a nice collection. All the Pullinses I can remember collected artifacts, and all the Nesius I know of have collected artifacts. My wife's mother was a Pullins, but it didn't get passed on to our children. So something broke down there in genetics. But the Pullins and Nesius, they seem to run side by side with Indian artifacts and fox hunting and wolf hunting and stuff like that. So we had a lot of parallels in that way. But Gene's dad was a very interesting man. He had a nice object.
Between these and that matching style.
Okay, this was your earlier paleo man there. They were used, and Phil, you have demonstrated the atlatl.
No.
You need to do that. Now this is the tool that they used. As it's displayed here, you can see that they're actually hunting. This is a makeup, of course. But this is what they had. The bow and arrow was a terribly, terribly recent invention. You got any volunteers? Try George.
It's the principle of physics. If I hold, yeah, I'm not going to throw it, George. It's not, I want to load it, George.
So we can,
Okay.
we only see the end.
All right, what we have is a throwing device. It can be any kind of a. These are actually replicas found in caves, preserved, and then redone. This is the way it was done. This is the way they were happy. The shaft generally is 4 feet long. And the throwing piece, and this is about the right length, 18 to 26 inches. What it does, it extends your arm. It's a principle of physics. If I hold this in my arm, I can throw it 30 feet. But if I extend my arm so that I can bring my weight forward with this as I throw it, I can bring it out to 70, 80 feet. Okay? Now, this is called a socket mount, which is probably a later invention. But you see what they've got is as they threw this, and if you were hunting an animal that size, throw this in. What would happen is this, easy to make, it's just a little shaft, would go in, this piece would fall off. So you get your rifle back, all you lost was your bullet. Okay? I'll break this thing in. And they could carry a whole packet of these little things, and you only had to have one of these spear shafts. And the thrower you keep with you, okay? But that's an atlatl, and this was the advance from the thrusting spear. If you go down to Ellie's and John, you have a whole day of learning how to throw these things. They teach that down there.
Aboriginal Alaska used them up, or Australia used them up too many years ago.
Yeah.
Very lethal weapon.
This thing works. It's about a day's practice, you can get pretty good with one of them. But you got to get real good at making the points first. That's how it works.
How's the point attached?
This point is attached, and it's a notch point. It's attached with, I would call it cat wrap. Okay, to the shaft. The shaft's split. It's opened up. The piece is slipped in. It's set, and probably was set in with sap from one of the trees. And then the wrapping put on, and that again then covered with sap and hardness.
So while you're on that, get into the atlatl banner weight, and then we'll get off of that.
Oh, okay. Here are banner stones of a sort of different, and we call them, I don't know why anybody called them banner stones, except that I think originally people...
If you notice, there's a butterfly form on this one right here.
Okay, like they did in England and places, they would, a shaft would have a banner. The theory was, and you can see how big the shafts were, there's a hole drilled in this. This was placed on the shaft for weight. And the theory being that as you threw it, the weight would slide forward and add you additional momentum to what you were throwing. That probably worked for some small pieces, like the tie-on pieces. Here's one here that ties on. When you got to the real nice ones, like here, the knob lune, they don't show any damage. And there's no way you could have been throwing that thing up and down a shaft that you wouldn't be getting damage on it. I think most people now think that the really perfected ones, especially the obeyed hold one, we know they didn't throw an obeyed shaft. I mean, how are you going to have a shaft that's obeyed and get it to fly? Were probably used as decorations on the end of a shaft, more for distinction within a group or clan. we know that these things were not used. Now, some of these tie-ons may have been originally, but it's clumsy. It's a lot of time to make one. Wasn't very efficient. Where the feathers, which came later, which this one happens to be fletched, would have been a lot greater invention than these things. This didn't really help.
It went through a lot of evolutions.
The evolution.
These different tools.
All the modern ones that are found, all are fletched. They're all socket mounted. This piece can change, but it all is an extension, a throwing device. That allows you to whip.
A lot of times on the end, the pivot point or the point that propulsion point of this particular piece could have been made of antler. They find several times they did use a piece of antler to put in the little hole in the shaft to propel it. The stone, again, you're talking laws of physics. You have extension to the arm, and you have stone for momentum. So this was all picked up. It took thousands of years. It took how many thousands of years to go from a full grooved axe found here at Cain's Pit, just north of town here, a little full grooved axe. It's interesting that it got broke out on the bit, which wouldn't be too unusual. They went ahead and smoothed it up and used it. They had a lot of work up here. They're going to go ahead and utilize it. So they repaired it. And then later on they find out, well, that would be terribly hard to keep tight in a handle, even though you had to draw it down, but on impact it's going to wobble. So they come up with a 3/4 axe. It took several thousand years before they decided that, and where they could wedge it and keep it tight. It made a firmer mount, so to speak. This would be the fronting of the axe. So things evolved, but it was very slow. Here's a stone we picked up. I don't know if you can see it or not, but this is a preformed axe. We find a lot of preformed stuff. Especially in banner stones. I've got a bird stone here. It should be drilled. It ain't. I've got pieces of slate at home. That's 95% done. They didn't drill the hole. They started the hole but didn't finish it. So we can assume they either lost it. They had to be superstitious, religious, clasp of thunder, something like this. May have been a bad sign and it was discontinued. A lot of artifacts, I'd say 10-15% of them, are preforms up to the finish, and then they cut just a little short. And it could very well be lost. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of, they moved around quite a little bit, but we find 10% of stuff we find is pieces that haven't been finished yet. Started but not finished. This is an axe. I don't know if you can see it, but they pecked a groove. Later they would have went all the way around. It'd probably be a 3/4 axe. What they did, they found a stone that was pretty close to what they wanted, which makes sense. They take another stone, they start pecking on it. You can see here where they pecked the groove, but for some reason they didn't finish it. But that's a preformed axe. It's not out of a real good material, but it is a preformed axe.
How old would you say that might be?
This piece, this one? Well, it looks to be a preform of a 3/4. So you're going back probably, the dates I mentioned this evening, I'd like to have, say, before present. When you get into A, you know, D, or what is it? BC and AD, it's kind of confusing. You got to subtract a couple thousand years. But 3/4 axe came in probably in the late Archaic, the early Archaic, and the Woodland period. We should probably go over this. This Archaic period, we're going from like 10,000. We're coming out of the Paleo. We're here in Jasper County. We're 10,000 years ago, up to about 3,500 years ago. This is what we consider the Archaic period. These people had the grooved axe. They had stone cells, which is I think I have one here today. It's a flaking tool. They worked a lot of hides. That was part of their livelihood. It was more of a flaking tool than anything. They had large flint tools. Archaic again. The points are big and bold. They were butchers. They're big and bold. Copper tools. There was copper brought into this area. They made, well, I could get into several caches. Let me skip over that for now. They had pennants. There's some there, Phil. We had pennants and gorgets. They're the slate rectangular pieces. They will have one hole or two holes. We're assuming chest ornaments. Once in a while in the burials you'll find them in the chest area. So we're assuming ornamental. These people were small animal hunters. They hunted the bear, the beaver, stuff like this. They congregated around these marshes where it's at. You know, that what a better place would it be is on the high ground around the marshes. They ate clam and fish. We know this because some of these archaic sites we find single component sites where we find archaic points. We find piles of clamshell. Then we also find snail shells there. The snail was there eating on the remains of what was left of the clams after the Indian got done with them. So that it can be considered established archaic site if you find these other archaic points to go along with it. They domesticated the dog. In several burials, they found the dog buried with the individual, and they had strong religious and social life. That brings us up to about 3,500 years ago. This culture, coming out of this culture, had all the above artifacts, but again, finally, we're talking 3,500 years ago, up to 1,500 years ago, we're up above AD. These people had ceramics. That's the first time ceramics came in, about the Christian period, 2,000 years ago. We find ceramic stuff. This stuff is still here today. Of course, it's broken up, but you find pottery sherds, which is not. But back then, the pottery was, I didn't bring it because it's fragile. We call it Marion thick, a real heavy pottery, very heavy, cumbersome pottery. It's grit tempered with pebbles, probably like buckshot out of a shotgun shell, big grit stuff. So the pots were crude. They had conical bottoms, but as pottery evolved rather quickly into our area into a flat bottom when we get into the woodland period, or into the later part of the woodland period, into the Mississippian period. Again, the woodland period had mica, which I know most of you know what mica is. It's a type of a material you can see through. In the old stoves, wood stoves and stuff, had little windows you look through the mica. Well, this is found in the Appalachian Mountains. That has been found in our area, traded into this area. 1,500 years ago was brought here. We find obsidian that was almost had to be brought in from the west, the Rocky Mountain area. You find copper. That would have come out of Lake Superior area. Unless an occasional piece of drift copper coming down, they would have utilized it. Conch shell from the Gulf of Mexico. I have found conch shell in this area. Where else could it come from? It had to pretty well be in the archaic period. Now here's the proof of it. The hogs rooted this out a mile south of my house years ago. I'm not so sure if your dad wasn't in on that, Linda, but this was rooted out on a sand hill on the John Schultz farm. And why the hogs rooted out, it was charcoal with the burial, which is not unusual. They did a lot of burning stuff. They probably had their ritual around the burying. And the hogs liked the charcoal. They rooted through that. And I remember the Pullens family went down there. And this is the spiral or the spine of a conch shell. If you look real close, you can see some of the swirl. That shell had to come from the Gulf. Nowhere else. It had to come from the Gulf. It's the Gulf conch. This piece of copper, which is not drilled, but it's a rectangular piece of copper. We can call it a gorget because it was a breastplate. This would come from Lake Superior. So you're talking 2,000 miles from the north, 1,500 miles from the south. I could see why that individual would have wanted it buried with him, because that had to be a very cherished assemblage right there. And we're back about 2,000 years where that place is. So in here in Jasper County. To me, that's terribly interesting. Okay. The woodland period is the classic period of all. We have the mound builders. I'm sure you all have heard of mound builders. And there are a lot of mythical things about it. There's some stuff has been proven wrong. But there was the Hopewell and the Adena people. Very different in physical stature, but very parallel on, we'll say, on their social life, their settlements and stuff like this. The Adena was tall, long-headed, Hopewell was short and squatty. But they had a lot of strong, so they had people who did nothing but trade, that brought these items into the area. They had engravers, some of the copper sheets that we find in Ohio that I've seen in Ohio. Ohio is a nucleus area. I should point this out. Most of your D and your Hopewell nucleus out of the state of Ohio. Chillicothe area is a terribly rich area. I was down there once with Neoma Gerber, an archaeologist down there that I visited with. And she took us to several of these mound sites. The Hornets Mound, terribly big structures of earth that they had carried up. And it just like, say, all of us, if someone should take over and say, all right, let's build a mound. And if you get a social group and keep us all busy, we're going to get something done. But if you just let us all sit around, we're going to go to sleep, or we're going to, just, it takes someone to keep this social thing alive and keep it going. These people knew to do that. They did in their earthworks. And what always surprised me, especially the Hornets Mound, huge. I would imagine if you had, say, 2 D6 caterpillars, it might take, maybe a week to push this much dirt up. But you can usually stand on that site and look out, and you can see where that dirt comes from. And it might be 3/4 of a mile away. If I was going to do it, lazy as I am, I'm going to find just right over here and just carry it over here and dump it. But they would go to quite a length to do it, and I don't think there's any barriers there why they had to do it. I think they knew that they wanted to keep these, the pyramids is another good example, in a more recent time. They kept their people busy. Again, you find signs, musical instruments. In some of these mounds that they dug, especially for the World's Fair in Chicago, met archaeologist. Help me out, Phil. Moorhead. Mr. Moorhead, he went around, he knew where to go. He went to Ohio in the Chillicothe area and with a team of excavators, and I think I would have liked him because he excavated like I did, as I understand. They dug hard and fast because they had to get these artifacts ready for the World's Fair. They pretty well dug most of the mounds, and the Hornets Mound was one of them, to get these artifacts to go to the World's Fair. But they had to get back to sheets of copper. They'd find sheets of copper where they had been cut out, scrolled. I mean, beautiful scroll work, and then etched. I mean, like, say, for instance, a demon or a dragon, a mythical image, something that they'd never seen before. But they display it on copper. Again, their imagination. That's what it was. I mean, there's no animal that they could relate to it. So they did have imagination. They had these people on pottery. Some of the later in that woodland period, they had beautiful pottery. You get into later the Mississippian period, it was a lot more refined and thinner. But the trade routes of these people was unheard of. To go 1,500 miles, Drew and I have a son lives in the Panhandle, right on the Gulf. I dread driving down there. It takes like forever to get down there, but these people actually went down there and bought the conch shell up. So maybe we shouldn't complain that much. They had drums and rattles. Very late in this period, the bow and arrow was invented. It took how many years? It took 38,000 years to invent the bow and arrow. This basically is an old bow. It got taped. It's sinewed. This goes back in probably the middle 1800s. It is an authentic bow. The bow is not large. It's not a recurve bow. It's not what's the bow with the wheels and the cables and the compound. It's not a compound bow. It's just a simple bow. So this particular bow, this particular invention, took a lot of different type point. They couldn't use some of these larger points. They'd have to use a point where the trajectory, the shaft is smaller. Trajectory would have to be, in order to keep the trajectory, they had to use a lighter point. So this changed, revolutionized the points that they used on shafts. They had smaller shafts, a lot like this. They had a little fine point on them. Their capacity as far as reach was increased quite a little bit. Now, if we take this bow, I'd like to take this bow and say, bring all these cultures, put all these cultures within a week. Compact them in a bucket and say within a week. And I'd say late, maybe on a Saturday night, about 10 o'clock, the bow and arrow made its existence. So it's a very recent invention. Most of these points here died, the individual didn't know what a bow and arrow was. They used the shaft, the spear, or the atlatl. So keep in mind the bow and arrow is very recent. We like to say arrowheads, but most arrowheads were atlatl points or something before the bow and arrow. As we come out of the woodland period, we get to the Mississippi. We kind of refer to these people as the farmers. You'll find these sites away from the main streams. I have done some digging, especially in Ohio. I didn't do any digging there, but I was on the site. You'll find post molds where There was a post at one time that rotted off. As you're going through the sand, it'll be a dark stain. And then as you dig on, you'll see a pattern. They were long rectangular places, storage for one thing. These people raised grain. They had to store it, and then they had to protect it. A lot like we do today. It's hard to just leave the house and go somewhere anymore. You have to stay around and have someone protect your stuff. So these people weren't quite as nomadic then. They weren't moving around because they had to stay around and protect what they had or somebody would take it. So they were handcuffing themselves. Our pottery got real refined, some beautiful pottery. Now these people that, I'd say that earlier glacial period went down to Central America, South America, Mexico, they came back up into our area. And when they came up, they advanced a lot quicker than ours did because it wasn't as harsh down there. We see kind of an influence of pottery from the south. And when it got into our area, it kind of changed our pottery too because we went directly to that, especially in the Mississippi and Arkansas area. A lot of pottery that Phil and I have are from Arkansas. Very nice pottery. It's nice. You can almost beat it around and not break. It's not terribly heavy. It's refined, and some etching on it, some even effigies. Some of it looks like a duck. Some beautiful coloring on some of it. So that pottery did progress to a very refined state. Tobacco. Now again, they were farming. They were raising tobacco. Of all things, one of our plagues today. Now these are pipes. This is a very refined pipe again. Albert, and I'm not sure your dad wasn't in on that, Linda, dug this pipe out of Albert Pullen's, out of Albert and Berthie's garden many years ago. A very refined Hopewell pipe. They did smoke tobacco and they raised it. This is a later pipe found up there just south. There where the Joe Grooms Bridge, we call it, where the bridge is out now, you can't cross. This pipestone pipe was dug there, as I understand. The material is catlinite. It's from Minnesota. So it came in Jasper County, somebody brought it in and made a pipe. It's a type stone that you can almost carve. It's very easily worked. Hoes, Mississippian people again were farmers. They used hoes. Very similar to this. I have several at home. This is a reproduction. But you notice a lot of polish. It's earth polish on the bit. It'll be real shiny, reflected in the light. And what's interesting to know, in some of them, there'll be a little notch where they maybe hit another rock, create a notch. But this little notch will have little fingers running up it. And what's happened, as they get these notches, kind of like a serrated tooth, the root will catch in that and then shear off. It just keeps making this little rub mark. So it's not unusual to have these little traces up because the notch catches the root and then shears it off and creates a little valley, showing extensive usage. So they did do a lot of farming. Stone effigy, they had very large stone effigy pipes. They call them, master pipes, the great pipes. Terribly big pipes like this. I've seen several. I had a chance to buy one, but I think that sucker was fake. I almost bet it was. There is a lot of fraudulent material out there, and what they make to resell as fraudulent is usually your very best. You know, they don't make a point, an everyday point. They'll make a 6 inch. They'd rather make it 6 inches than make it 8 inches. See, and there's not too many of them authentic around. Now, we do find dugouts, or have, in the Kankakee area. August Johnson found one up there in the Kankakee, down sunk in the mud. They were digging it out, and being it in the mud, in the muck and the mire, no oxygen, it was still intact. He took it out, cleaned it out, and it sold with his collection. And now I think it's in southern Indiana. Where's that at, Rita? Ain't paying attention. At a museum in southern Indiana, Nashville, Indiana. It's a dugout canoe. It's probably 13 foot long. But what they did, they just took a canoe, they took a log, I would cedar log, And they would use a tool, an adze like this. But they knew enough to go out, not to go out and cut a tree down and just start beating on a tree. They were smarter than that. They would char that tree. They'd build fire around char. Then knock the char off and then char it some more. Same with a log. They would get the top off of it. They would put fire down the center and let it burn out. Then they'd hew it out like this, get down to fresh material again, and refire it until they got the cavity that they wanted into that dugout. This is considered an adze. Again, I'm talking about treasures and stuff in some of these burials. The Hopewell mounds had very lavish burying offerings. Some of them that I can't even comprehend. I've seen some stuff in Ohio in a museum. I went with Leonard Hurley. Leonard's passed away since. He was a good friend of mine. That's who I went over there with. And we ran into an older fellow named Alvy McGraw. And he was a student of archaeology. He's probably he wasn't a graduate archaeologist, but he was terribly interested. And in his particular area around Chillicothe, you can go out there and you still see landforms, geometrically laid out landforms that had to take a long, long time to bury. And they were probably pretty well set up for off-reading and temples and stuff like this. And he said, before you boys go back, to stop at the Chillicothe Museum, says it broke. He says, but see if they won't take you to the back room. So we mentioned Alvy's name. Oh, come on back, boys. So we went back in there, and I didn't want to leave. But I did talk her out of a Ohio flint core, which is a lot like Phil was showing here. Ohio Ridge core. They had bushel baskets full of them like this. You can see where they're knocking the bladettes off. A beautiful chalcedony type chert. But they had people donate to museums, and once it gets in the museum, they're usually locked in. They can't sell it, and then next thing you know, they don't have room to display it, so it ends up in a box. Then you get someone in there's not too ethical, and out the back door it goes. This happens time after time, so that's why I was always a little hesitant to do anything like that. Bill?
Bob, how high are those mounds? I've been over to travel over several of those mounds in southeastern Ohio. Someplace over there's a large circle, maybe a mile around. Can you tell us if you have any idea what that is?
Probably the Serpent Mound.
Made by the Indians.
Probably the Serpent Mound, I imagine. That's the largest mound over there. They have tried to excavate different areas, especially the head area. They're looking for artifacts, but they have never found any offerings in that particular structure that I know of or have heard of. Later Indians would bury intrusively into these mounds because they were elevated, and they assumed that early cultures used them. I mean, it was outstanding. Back then, they were a lot higher and more prominent. They would bury into them. The highest, Bill, Horner's Mound was 18 feet when I was there, and I'm sure it eroded some. I know Dr. Rowley, he just dug a hole down. He got down into, what they usually do, they put them on ground level, or they'll bury it intrusively in the ground. Then they build a log structure up. And that's where they place this one particular chieftain of high social standing. And then they start piling dirt in. After a while that collapsed and leaves a little bit of a slump at the top of it. So Dr. Honeywell, he knew where to dig. Moorhead. He just dug down in this crater, took what artifacts, and they were lavish. That's where that copper sheet come from. Some just beautiful, beautiful pieces of relics and stuff. And the Chicago Fair, now whether it's split 2 cents, I don't know. Columbus, Ohio we was in that museum. There's a lot of stuff on display there. But again, it's not the original piece, it's a cast of the original, which seems to be what most of the people are doing now. The museums, they like to put these out on pedestals, say for instance a banner stone or maybe one of these finer blades, to where you can feel it. It'll be, affixed to the pedestal. But those pieces, of course, are reproductions. It's not hard to reproduce. You take cast original and make a cast of it and display that. So you're displaying basically the characteristics of it, but it's not the original. Because the original, that Adena pipe, which is an outstanding piece, shows a man. It's hard stone, has the ear spoons and the whole works. It's priceless. But it's in the Columbus Museum, a replica of it. And the original one, I assume it's there somewhere. A lot of the pipes that come out of that same mound, 36 or 37 Hopewell monitor pipes, are over in England of all places. They ended up in England, the museum over there, and they're still there yet. They said they would let us have them on loan.
You mentioned that pipestone pipe over there. Is that from the Pipestone Indians in southwestern Minnesota?
Now, the pipestone derivates from the Ohio origin of the stone. We call it pipestone because they made pipes out of that stone. It's a white stone. I have some at home. Again, it's almost carvable. They use sandstone as abrasive to form this stuff, just a hunk of sandstone. And you could form it quite well, and it withstood heat. It's an easy stone to work. Engraved shell gorgets. A lot of times in the burial of the Mississippian people, we're getting into the Mississippi, and this is back to the farmers again. It wasn't unusual for them to take a piece of shell and engrave on it. They would use flint, of course, sharp flint, and they make their etchings just very precise, very well done. Something beyond, like George does at doodling. They did it on shell, and they had ability. These people had ability. They had musical ability, artistic ability, and they knew how to survive. They were really peaceful people until the Europeans came over to give them reason to fight, the way I always looked at it. They were more concerned about livelihood, and they had their spats back and forth, but mostly playful, as I understand. Now, back to this Mississippian period, the farmer group, we noticed a decline in mortuary practices. Society was breaking down a little bit. They were more concerned about everyday existence. They were putting their interest that way. And so their burials, usually you'll find maybe a pipe. I've seen been on some sites in different states where they had dug Mississippi. And that's what you mostly see now because they're not as old and they're in better shape. And you find pipes with, or not pipes, but pots with them. They're a flat bottom pot. They might have a black substance inside we consume as food, and maybe a few shell beads, but nothing lavish, no obsidians or copper or anything like that. So socially they came down a little bit in the mortuary practice, kind of declined in that particular period. Also, there's remnants they've done. When you do some excavating, they get down real close. I mean, you can just about tell. You take everything off, you don't even see patterns in the ground. They had like little garden plots like we do today. The families, probably in these rectangular houses and stuff, they may be 100, 200 people, these enclosures, these different enclosures around a tight area. They were beginning to become more social, more in a community type people. Now, Phil, I don't know, I think maybe we should go over some of this stuff here. Is there any questions now? Any questions at all?
You mentioned that according to that chart in the Mississippi era, they were into intensive agriculture and they lived in more wooded area. And then in the earlier periods, they had lived in those high areas and then hunted the wildlife that was prolific on the marshes, the swampy areas. What about the extensive prairie area over a lot of the Midwest? Did any of these people in these periods take advantage?
The prairies were probably considered mostly low-laying ground, but still dry. That's how I would.
With high prairie vegetation, that would
be area that I would assume probably the buffalo and the different animals roamed in, and it would be a hunting area to them, away from the natural streams and stuff, away from their campsite. I think it was in Indiana when they came here, it was all prairie area. You read some of them early books, it was considered a prairie land, big tall prairie grass, even the Gifford area in places like where we're from. Grass and stuff.
So besides hunting in the marsh area, they might have ventured into the prairie areas to hunt? I
would think so, because they would, again, the buffalo stuff would lead them in there.
But they made no attempt to do agriculture in that area?
No, I think they kept that pretty close to the encampment. Their encampment would have been high. The later Indian had a little problem coming across the Kankakee. Most of Mississippian people were north of the river. It was high and dry. Where on the south side of the river, it was pretty bogus. It was wet and some problems. So most of late Mississippi and early contact period where the Europeans brought beads over, buttons and stuff like that. You don't find much in this area. Occasionally trade pipes made out of clay that the Europeans brought over, and they traded quite readily because it was handy for them. They were different effigies. But that stuff you find north of Kankakee River. Not so much. I've been on these hills many times, and you might find a stem or something. But you get up there north of the river, and it's there. Beads and copper beads, glass beads. See, what them glass beads, Dave? Remember they were the country that made those? Or by Italy, but they brought a lot of beads into this area, and they're very recognizable. They're colors or swirls and things like that. Again, this area, not so much of it. North of the river.
From what era are the Indians that lived where the Dixon Mounds are in Illinois?
Okay, the Dixon Mounds, that is a very prolific site. I think that was probably, let's say that's a chronology dig, really. As you go down, it was 13 feet, I believe it is. What you do, they're slicing this mound down like this, and of course, the deeper you go, the earlier the cultures are. And it started out, I think, with the very latest Mississippian people. That's how they discovered by the pottery sherds of the late Mississippian people. But as they were going down, of course, it got earlier and earlier. They found a dog burial at 2,500 feet. I remember I was there not too long after that. And they were going down, getting into the Paleo period. And so that was a multiple component site. What made that so rich, there's a bluff just west of them. And as the water stuff would erode this bluff, it washed down and couldn't clear this area out and make a new floor plan. This is how the chronology come there, because this bluff constantly would come down like a layer cake and would clear things up, cover them up, and then later we dig down through and we have black, and then you'll have an area maybe of pure sand for 18 inches. That's an area, a period of time that the Indians didn't live there because there was no middens, so to speak. And what happened there, maybe they used all the trees up in that area for firewood, so rather than carry the wood in, they'd move over here. But it was such a light, it was right on a natural river, just such a nice place to be if there was trees and stuff for firewood. It's just a natural location. So by these different intermediate periods when trees and stuff would come back, other cultures later on would move in and pick up on it. So that was a chronology dig. Now what's the other site? That St. Louis?
Keokuk.
What is it?
Keokuk. That's the section.
Keokuk. Yeah, that was a large site. They was a very large establishment there. I don't know too much about that site. You, Phil?
It's kind of unusual. The two big sun cultures, the Keokuk site down by St. Louis and the Etowah Mountains of Georgia. The Etowah Mountains of Georgia, those are going to find marble statues. Actually, those mounds are like pyramids. They're about 70 feet high. Had steps going up the top of. If you're ever down in Georgia, going to Florida, stop at Etowah and go through the museums. It's unbelievable. They were blood culture, and so were the Keokuk people. So what made Keokuk so interesting was it flourished at the time that Europe was in the Dark Ages. And it was a settlement of about 30 acres surrounded by a stockade. You can imagine building a 20-foot stockade of pecan trees around 30 acres. Imagine what a task that was. Inside were over 20,000 people. It made it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. But as I said, they were cult worshippers, and there was a lot of sacrifices. There were some exquisite artifacts around there, but there was blood culture. It's kind of different than the farming that Bob's talking about. Etowah was the same one. Massive mounds, a lot of blood sacrifice.
Phil, I've got some notes on this. It says the site in Illinois across from St. Louis boasted a population of over 20,000 inhabitants. We call this site Cahokia. This was a 100-acre city, all enclosed by high fence. Now it shows remnants of this fence deteriorating away. 3 different times they rebuilt that fence, so they were there for a considerable time. This settlement was one of the largest in the world at that time. So that's saying something for our American Indians. Any other questions this time? Bill?
Glass there by north of the Kankakee River. Was traded with the French traders? Did they come? Do you have any idea? Thought they come down the Michigan Trail across? or soft trail and traded with these people, or what? Or do you have any idea what happened?
Yeah, Bill, when Shirley come February? Come back in February. Shirley's going to pick up on the contact period. I thought she's going to be here this evening, but probably the fog scared her off. But she gets into that quite well. That's ball game, room ball. I don't want to quote it. That'd probably be wrong. Any other questions, fellas?
Bob, at this point, were there tribes, or were they just like, you say, the Mississippian or whatever? I mean, did they have actual tribes?
Okay, that's a good question. I usually point that out. They'll say, what tribe made this point? Well, we can't say tribe. We can say it was a group of people within the woodland period. Maybe be more specific. We can look at the point that look heart-shaped or something. We say it was the Hopewell people within the woodland period. And then, but to go to tribes, you're talking a little later. You're talking, just before contact period, right after contact period. You get Cherokee and Algonquin, which Linda's dad wasn't very fond of, and that's when you get into tribes. These people were just groups within a period. So to be more explicit, we just keep it that way because they were family groups. The earlier paleo people were just close family groups, maybe 6, 8, 10 or something like that at a time. Not large people. They probably couldn't fend for that many people at one time. So they were just small groups, and later they became more social. They got into settlements. But to put tribes on, I like to put that late, maybe 1,000 years ago, and then, before present. You got a question, Ann?
I saw a drawing one time, and it said whenever you see the Indians in a picture that are using a bow and arrow to kill the mammoth, it's wrong.
You bet it's wrong. You bet it's wrong. They're using the atlatl here. This shows the shaft, like Phil was explaining there, and they had the extension and the stone for momentum. So this represents well, but I know Phil and I wouldn't go out and slay an animal like this with that primitive tool unless he was stuck in the muck or something like that. If he's at a disadvantage, but to go stick an arrow in one of them and make him mad, I don't think so.
Tall, You imagine a little 5-foot guy going up for a 14-foot animal and 14-foot to show him. He's only 5 feet tall. His wife only about 4 foot wide.
They took advantage of the situation. A lot of times they catch them in an avalanche or something. Maybe the animal's sticking out of an avalanche and they would feed on it.
Chase them over a cliff or something.
Right.
They did that also, especially buffalo, the later people.
They just heckled them till they got tired.
Yeah. Your coyotes, your wolves and stuff today do the same thing. They were watching the animal too. They had animal instincts. They learned by watching. They claim it was vegetation to start with, but you watch the animals eating meat. So said, hey, that might be good. So they claim that. We're going way back. What period I don't want to get into. Any other questions?
Camel is included among the animals.
Yes, we had a prehistoric camel. We had a prehistoric horse, but they phased out and European reintroduced the horse.
Those are being excavated at the fall site in Nebraska now. Camel and rhinoceros.
The saber-toothed tiger. That might have been where Phil got his plaid vest. I'm not sure, but these animals are gigantic. They had a ground sleuth that looks like a beaver. And they display that, they would be about there. Yeah, just terribly large animals. Any other questions? Let me go to this cache here, which I'm pretty proud of. I just bring it out in rare occasions. This is one today. This cache is owned by August Johnson. This gentleman and his wife knew Augie and Blanche. These are considered mortuary blades. They're turkey tail in design. They go back right at 2,000 years ago. Could go back as 2,500 years ago. Usually with these particular burials, there's copper. Now this particular burial didn't have copper that I know of. It wasn't unusual for them to take copper. They hammered copper. They didn't smelt it or anything like that. They knew by hammering copper it would make it soft and they could form it like we do pie dough, for instance. And by rolling it over a stick, they had a bead. The people were known to roll copper beads. On some of this, you'll notice some red stain. Augie Worsted, you should know. But there's some red stain there, and that's nothing but iron ore. Iron ore was brought into this area as a red pigment. And in burying it, they used a lot of that in their mortuary practice. Red ochre is a very common material to find with the red ochre people because it was named after their culture. The material, again, is the material Phil was showing over there, the Indiana hornstone. They like the hornstone because it's very controllable, very predictable. It worked quite well. It wasn't a knotty chert like we find around here sometimes. The white material is Illinois Burlington, or not Burlington, but yeah, Burlington. Okay. Again, these pieces here, especially this one, is not much thicker than a piece of corrugated cardboard. A lot of thinning flakes across the face of the blade until you'd ever attempt to try one. You can't hardly appreciate the ability that these people had to make this stuff. I don't think everyone in the particular group were, what you say, professional or accomplished flint knappers. Maybe just a few, but these few got around. These few established types. You'll find this particular blade in Ohio, Illinois, northern Michigan, all over. So I think these flint knappers, especially the very best ones, would travel. And as they traveled, they had the established type, and they were copied after. The only time you'll see similarity is usually whatever the game that they were to get, the game that they were to slay and to live on, that predicted what type point they had to make. Whatever, it actually dictated if they needed a point, like for the woolly mammoth, they needed that slender, streamlined point. For birds and stuff like that, they used a smaller point. Scrapers, you can see where they took some of these broken points. They did a lot of, flint was hard to get by, and they'd break a point. Instead of throwing it away, they'd chip on the end of it and make a scraper to scrape hides with. So they utilized a lot of their mistakes or breakage type things. You see a lot of that in material we find today on the sand hills. We used to go out, I remember when I was with Earl, if it wasn't a good one, the tip was broke or something like that, we'd leave it lay. We're out there today picking that stuff up because that's all that's left. Again, this is that, most of this is archaic. This is a beautiful piece of heat-treated chert. These people knew how to heat-treat material. This is the same, basically the same type stuff you see over there in the white blades I held up. But they somehow struck on the heat treatment. It brought the color out and it made it a lot more workable. This again is a preform of a Snyder point. It would have looked like this should they have attempted to finish it. We were found up there, Gary, just across the highway where Nick used to live on what's that, them brothers? There by Teach, John Teach's dad was in behind them. Walter Brothers, yeah, right. That was found, it was one of the nicest ones. I know most of the collectors in the Midwest, this is probably as nice as the very best. I've seen a lot of them, and this is a very exquisite piece. Again, you know, we talk about Hopewell and Adena being in the same social class and stuff. This is classic Hopewell, this is classic Adena. Just, you know, same, they were here at the same time. They both pretty well come out of the Ohio area, but their physical structure was just about as different as those points were. But again, they had strong social ties. They were both mound builders, so they had a lot of similarity there other than physical. And this again was a knife. There was a knife that we call it a primary knife because it hadn't been resharpened. A lot of these points, you notice a bevel there on these, and they seem to be a little short. Especially this one, I guess. And maybe that, it's a little short. At one time, it may have been another 3/4 of an inch longer. But as they were using it for knives, the edge would dull, just like our kitchen knives would dull. So what they do, they lay it on their leg and they start reflaking it again to get a new edge on it. And usually by doing it, they would saw-tooth it, make it a little more aggressive, and as they would flip it over and do it again, they have a bevel. Bevel is nothing but a byproduct of resharpening. The bevel wasn't put on there like some of the old timers say to make a twist. but they were knives, they weren't shot to start with. But the beveling was just a byproduct of resharpening. So, and we see a lot of that. This blade has never been resharpened.
I have one of those bevels that has been sharpened until it's almost down to the knuckle. And it's nearly straight across.
Yeah, they didn't throw that stuff away because, again, the availability of that stuff was that easy to get.
The knife part.
On chipping, you can see here on this particular piece, I don't know if you noticed or not, there's a little tit right there in the center of that concave part. That was where they would grind it out and then give it a flick like that. It kind of give it a little starter pull tab effect to make the fluting. That's considered a striking platform. They did that, and I know Don Coughlin, he set down, chip out a piece. He'll chip a couple times, and he'll sand. He'll take that sandstone, he'll just wipe on there, and it'll get all smoothed off. He gave him a little platform, and bang, just like that, he'll strike it off, you know. Then he raises his hand, he looks underneath, see what kind of chip he got. But he has glasses on, he does that. They didn't, of course. One other piece, this is probably one of the better artifacts. This, again, is Halleck, considered a banner stone. The symmetrics of it is, I think, pretty darn good. It's a knobbed lunate banner. Again, it came from a weight on a spear thrower, but they went into, I feel, an evolution social, say a hood ornament for Cadillac. You know, this fella had it, you know, and that was found up there in Mr. Gearing's onion field years ago. Bill, you're going to run me out of here, I guess. To get wound up.
Yeah, it's 9 o'clock and...
Had a good audience, and believe me.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Bob for making this presentation tonight. I thought I'd tell all of you, the presenters for this entire series are volunteers. No one's getting paid for any of this. It's all sharing of their knowledge with you so that you learn a little bit about your county. The things Bob went over today I knew about. What I'm waiting to find out is about the Dutch and German immigrants to Demont, which I know nothing about. And I'm really interested in hearing that in the upcoming lectures. But to comment on the tray of artifacts at the end of the table, that is probably the finest group of artifacts ever came out of this county. That is the premier pieces there.
Come out of Lake County, but just across the river on the Lake County side.
And so that, for our area, that's the finest grouping that's ever been found. Now there's some nice individual pieces that you'll see here, but not as a group. That's the finest group that we have, and maybe the finest in the Midwest. So Bob, I'd like to thank you for the time you spent. If I could meet with those of you who are taking it for credit afterwards so we can go over some guidelines of what's going to happen if you get snowbound. See you all next week.
Thank you. I understand it's no longer foggy out. The gentleman from DeMont told me so.
These are from the same man that found that dugout?
Yes.